that we've shared with our stakeholders over the last year, it is important to note that the road to COP30 in Belém honestly started in Baku, as we all know, with a lot of disappointment and anger, I think, that we felt in terms of the disappointment around the lack of substantial public financing from the global north to the global south. Moreover, the lack of NDCs, what I call the nationally determined contributions from the global north in preparation for Belém, has also given frustration to this path and this road that we've been under over the last year. But there is a sign of hope, and I think we were all, in one way or the other, part of the Africa Climate Week and Africa Climate Summit in Ethiopia, where I do think Africa really stood up and showed their priorities as we are heading towards Belém. And I'm sure that the speakers that we have here will speak about those aspects a bit more, but generally speaking, we will be focusing on those things that are priority to Africa, which is adaptation, just transition, financing, of course, as well as other issues around loss and damage funds and the likes. So this was just a brief introduction for myself, but there will be about 5 speakers with you and with us today. That'll be Mohammed Odo from PowerShift Africa, the director, Amos Wemanya from Greenpeace Africa, Amy Gillenthorpe, the program director at PowerShift Africa, my good sister Wafa Misra from CAN Africa, who I personally call my actual boss when it comes to anything related to COP. She's the one who leads the African work, so great to have you here. And of course, Ndugu Sada Salah, who will be speaking on finance, and our senior finance thought leader at PowerShift Africa. Thank you so much for your presence. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Mohammed to give us a broad overview, a lot deeper than what I just gave, into the priorities around COP30 for Africa. Thank you so much, Mohammed.
Thanks so much, Kuda. Good afternoon, colleagues. What we have in Belém is an opportunity to help turn the many promises that have been made to practice. And we have an opportunity as a continent with a shared vision and demands for real delivery on climate commitments. Our continent is calling for COP30 in Belém to mark as a turning point from the promises of the past to practice and from ambition to actual implementation. More than a decade after the Paris Agreement, was signed, and that agreement transforming, global climate governance, COP30 must now prove that the multilateral climate system can deliver tangible results for all. If you remember, the first global stocktake at COP28 in Dubai that helped to agree that important decision to phase out fossil fuels and triple renewable energy and double energy efficiency has to be implemented. And last year in Baku, we had the adoption of the global goal on finance, the new collective quantified goal that was agreed. So what we need Belém to do is now to help turn those important commitments into practice. We are a continent that is on the front line of climate change, and words alone will not avert climate catastrophe. And what we need is to help make Belém the COP that helps to turn that ambition into practice, making it real, fair, and for it to be felt in people's everyday lives. What we're seeking in Belém is not a special treatment for our continent, but demanding fairness and delivery. This continent is warming at twice the global average, and we've contributed the least to the climate crisis. The whole of Africa accounts for less than 4% of the global emissions, yet it's on the front line and it's bearing the brunt of the changes that are happening in our planet. And if you look at adaptation, our needs exceed 70 billion annually, and only about 15 billion is what is been pledged and provided, while loss and damage costs are rising to nearly $500 billion by 2030. So what we're calling for is for the tripling of adaptation finance beyond the current pledge to double by 2030, and we want to help embed both finance and clean technology transfer as binding obligations under the UN process, but not as voluntary gestures of goodwill, which is what you have the rich world provide in these spaces. So the world no longer needs more promises, but proof that climate multilateralism can still deliver in this time of geopolitical turbulence and deliver for all. If COP30 is to be remembered as the implementation COP, it must be remembered as a moment Africa helped re-anchor, global climate regime in fairness, solidarity, and accountability. I think we need COP30 as the place that not only recognizes Africa's disproportionate vulnerability, but also finally act on the historic responsibility to support our adaptation and resilience actions. Africa is not arriving in Belém empty-handed. We bring solutions, renewable energy potential, vast arable land, a vision for climate justice that is rooted in fairness and prosperity. What we need now is delivery on finance, delivery of clean technology, delivery of trust, because that is critical. And we're demanding that these promises that have been made, on emissions reductions to hold warming to below 1.5 degrees, to help, agree a global goal on adaptation, to deliver clean technology transfer, to mobilize, climate finance in the trillions, is actually delivered. We want investment. And that investment is going to help create clean jobs. It's going to protect our communities. And we want COP30 to show that global leaders see Africa not just as a place of vulnerability or even as a victim, but as a partner in leading the world to a safer, fairer climate future. So we will be going to Belém next week to help drive a new era of climate cooperation that is grounded in African realities, in climate equity, and also in opportunity. I can't fail to remind us that our continent has vast renewable energy potential. It has human talent, and it's also the youngest continent, and also has ambition to power a cleaner and more resilient economy in Africa, but also contribute to a cleaner and more resilient global economy. But what we need to help realize that vision is fair access to finance, fair access to clean technology that helps to make this vision possible. Belém must not be the moment that, the world comes to talk and make pledges. I think we need to move beyond pledges and truly invest in Africa's, transition. The report that we're launching today will help reaffirm the principles of transparency, inclusivity, and accountability, while resisting, the growing trend towards side deals and unilateral measures that are likely to undermine the UN process. We're calling on African negotiators to act as a united strategic bloc across the different negotiation issues: finance, adaptation, just transition, trade, and to work closely with civil society. Not just civil society, but also with our youth, our indigenous people, so that we can ensure that climate diplomacy remains people-centered and justice-driven. So among the recommendations we're making this year is the full operationalization of an important article that was agreed in Paris 10 years ago, Article 9.1, that has made a binding financial obligation for the developed countries to provide to developing countries. So we want to help make sure that this important article is operationalized so that we move to help deliver the kind of climate ambition that is required. We're calling for the establishment of a technology implementation program that helps to remove the barriers to innovation in the global south, and the creation of a Belém action mechanism that can help developing countries design and be able to deliver, equitable transitions. So this is an opportunity we have in the COP, and I hope we can be able to realize. One final thing I wanted to close with is we can't deny the fact that tackling the climate crisis is humanity's, greatest challenge. And we will take on that fight with or without the help of the United States. The Trump administration has withdrawn the US from the Paris Agreement. And as a continent that has seen the impact of climate change firsthand, it saddens us that the US is leaving the field when we need to be all working together. But I must say this, the rest of the world cannot allow our common home to be destroyed because of the ignorance of one man in the White House. And so at COP30, the rest of the world needs to push forward. We need to harness the benefits of a clean energy transition and help deliver cheap, clean, renewable energy and help work towards ending the fossil fuel era, and suddenly work to deliver a more resilient future by finalizing the global goal and adaptation framework, but also importantly, make sure that that framework is fully financed to help build our adaptive capacity so that we can have forward-looking plans that allows us to integrate climate risk and uncertainties and be able to build sufficient adaptive capacity to help us withstand any of the predicted changes. And so Belém for Africa, to sum up, has to help the world move from promises to practice. And we've set out our priorities, and we invite you to join us in helping to make them realized through the final COP30 outcome. Thank you.
Masi, ngiyabonga, Majita. Thank you so much, Mohammed, for that. I think you really espoused some of the major reasoning as to why we have to hold on as much as possible as Africa into this goal that we have at COP30. And I just want to add to what you mentioned around Africa, first of all, being a solution center for a lot of the things that we want to do. And secondly, pushing against the fact that we're being told that our home is not worth saving. Our home is worth saving at the end of the day, and it's up to us to do that. And this is not just happening at the COP30 process. We're seeing this also in the G20 process, which is for the first time being hosted on the African continent. So we should be aware that this is not a climate issue, as some people say. The global north, USA in particular, they don't care about anything that does not have them at the center of it all. And in all these spaces and all these forums, up to us to defend as much as possible. And on that priority list that you just shared, I'll then invite my colleagues at PowerShift Africa to just insert a link for all our listeners today to the policy brief in the chat, and you'll be able to access it. And from there, I'll now ask Amy. I think we heard Mohammed speak a lot about adaptation, and for the first time in a long time in anything COP, adaptation is going first, and I'm very excited about that. And I won't ask a question, Amy, but I'll ask you this simple suggestion. Please explain to people why adaptation is such an important thing for Africa. So simple, yet so many people forget why these indicators are so important.
Thanks, Kuda. And yes, agreed. Thanks, Mohammed, for really helping set the scene, particularly for adaptation. And good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I think just to say that I'm really happy that we're having this conversation before and as the world starts to gather in Belém for COP30. And on that note, I think, Kuda, just to your question, before we turn to outcomes and priorities for adaptation, it's really important for us to first take stock to understand and recognize where adaptation stands and why it's important, particularly for Africa, both politically and in terms of the financial realities. First off, I think we need to emphasize that adaptation has been sidelined to mitigation in the UNFCCC process for far too long. So COP30 really it's a key political opportunity and moment for adaptation in that, firstly, it's become central to Brazil's COP vision, but also it marks two critical adaptation milestones. The first being to finalize the indicators to track progress towards the 11 global goal on adaptation targets. And the second being the 2025 deadline for developed countries to deliver on the Glasgow Pledge to double adaptation finance to developing countries. And this deadline is fast approaching. The challenge that we face is that with the current geopolitical fractures, the shrinking development and climate finance, combined with economic slowdowns that we've seen across the course of 2025, they create a sobering and complex reality negotiation landscape as we move into COP30. And this is particularly the case for adaptation. Mohammed mentioned, the adaptation finance gap for Africa. And some of these findings or these challenges for adaptation were reaffirmed in UNEP's latest 2025 Adaptation Gap Report, which was aptly titled Running on Empty. And essentially those findings warn that developing countries' needs are escalating. They're now between 310 and 365 billion per year by 2035. The challenge, though, is that international public adaptation finance is actually falling. So I think it dropped from about 28 billion to 26 billion US dollars between 2022 and 2023. And it's projected to decline further. And so at this pace, if these current trends continue, the Glasgow Pledge, which is really just a drop in the ocean compared to adaptation needs, particularly for Africa, for climate vulnerable regions, this pledge risks becoming another broken promise, and it risks further eroding trust in the COP process and sidelining adaptation yet again. And we've seen across Africa how we are already facing and living with this implementation and finance gap, with droughts, floods, food insecurity, climate-induced displacement, just to name a few, worsening each year. So within this context, COP30 has to be a political turning point for adaptation. We've come too far to let it slide. And so it's really an opportunity for adaptation to achieve parity with mitigation and also to restore faith in the process. And I think this is really something that Mohammed has emphasized in his opening remarks. So on that note, for Africa, there are three key adaptation priorities. The first being, we need to see parties adopt a strong fit-for-purpose set of indicators that really will track progress across the key adaptation sectors. So those are the 7 thematic targets that were established under the UAE Framework for Global Climate Resilience as a way of achieving the global goal on adaptation. And then also for tracking the 4 stages of the adaptation policy cycle. Importantly to emphasize here, particularly for Africa and other climate vulnerable regions, is that this final set of indicators must include a sizable share of indicators that adequately track quality adaptation finance, that track capacity building and technology transfer from developed to developing countries, what we refer to as means of implementation. And this is key to delivering meaningful action in all countries. Now, this was a sticking point in Bonn, and we're likely to see this play out unfold again in the negotiation rooms in Belém. Africa has a key role to play here as the brainchild, or the GGA being, the product of the Africa group's thinking, for them to play a key role in holding the line to secure these means of implementation indicators, and also to coordinate with finance negotiators to ensure there's a link to predictable grant-based finance. Just to provide some quick insights into the current state of play from a recent workshop that was held in October, where parties and experts who've developed these indicators met. Basically, it was a reality check, and it highlighted that more work is needed, given that serious issues remain in terms of data gaps, unclear methodologies, inclusion of indicators on private finance, but also that the indicators we currently have on means of implementation are insufficient and inadequate. So all this to say that alongside adopting indicators, Africa also needs to push for a process of continued work and refinement of these indicators post-Belém, and agree on how these targets and indicators will be used and integrated at the national level. So for instance, how will they be used and integrated into our planning systems, our reporting systems, and what type of institutional capacity will need to be built to translate these into action. So the second priority for Africa here is to ensure what's called the Baku Adaptation Roadmap, which was also established at COP28, but so far lacks a clear mandate. It needs to be a mechanism to drive implementation of the GGA targets and indicators, and be a coordinating mechanism for adaptation agenda items. But really, I think the important point to emphasize here is that the Baku adaptation roadmap needs to accelerate delivery of adaptation action and support. And then last but certainly not least, none of this, the GGA framework and all other initiatives, will not matter without finance. So Africa must push for a new political commitment that scales quality adaptation finance that is accessible, that is predictable, that is grant-based, and specifically calling for immediate tripling of adaptation finance by 2030, but also recognizing that this is not sufficient to bridge the vast adaptation finance gap. And so this would need to be coupled then with a process to establish a new needs-based goal or regime that links directly to the GGA process and the cost of achieving the targets, because so far we don't even know what it will cost to achieve these 11 targets. So I'll end off by saying that success at COP30 for adaptation will not just depend on technical agreement over indicators, but truly and really on political will. The political will to ensure quality adaptation finance and better tracking through means of implementation indicators go hand in hand. They are what will turn adaptation from a promise on paper into a lifeline for Africa, climate vulnerable countries and regions, and communities on the front lines. I'll stop here, Kuda. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Amy. I think it was really fantastic how you really brought it into context why adaptation is so important. When I think of adaptation, I always talk about it being the foundation for everything else that we want to do in terms of Africa's development. You cannot have any form of development without adaptation within the context of climate change. And I think having that language and understanding what that could look like with the indicators is a big part of that reason. And I'd like to urge to those who are on board today that Amy mentioned something that is important, the importance of the negotiating tracks and how difficult it was in Bonn for the adaptation, and to reflect on ourselves as African civil society. How much engagement are we doing with the actual negotiating during the COP process? That is so, so important. From my own experience, I've seen that there is definitely a lack of capacity, and that's the reality with a lot of our states when it comes to negotiating power. Are we able to fill that gap, especially when it comes to some very technical things around adaptation, but also pushing their political will around really pushing and emphasizing why adaptation is not secondary but primary? So thank you so much, Amy, for that. I'd like to now go to the person who I called out as my boss during the COP process, who of course is Dr. Wafa. Wafa, I think you're going to be speaking about something that we've got both dear at heart around, which is the Just Transition Work Program. And I think it'll be interesting to hear from you. What are the key plans around the Just Transition Work Program? What are we hoping to get out of that? And there's a mechanism that you mentioned that you're pushing. I think you called it BAM. Well, what is BAM, Wafa?
Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kuda. So I am not your boss, but I am so happy. I'm so glad to be working with you together with the team of PowerShift Africa. Always a good support to have you on board. And to talk about BAM, I actually would love to mention something before BAM, because there is another initiative that this COP presidency is pushing for, which can't be seen as a distraction, which is the Tropical Forest Forever facility. What we call the TFFF, which is a fund meant to raise around $120 billion to protect tropical forests. And what we don't know is that fund actually combines public and private money, and it promises payments to countries, especially in the global south, for every hectare of forest they are conserving. But the problem is that this isn't new and it's not fair. It's actually another market-based mechanism that benefits investors more than the countries it claims to help, because this fund depends on loans and on bonds, because meaning that developing countries could end up paying interest through debt to finance their own conservation. Not only that, it also sets complex conditions. I'll just give you an example. So only forests with a surface of 20 to 30%, meaning the percentage of land covered by trees, crowns, when seen from above, will qualify. And this one size-fits-all rule ignores Africa's diverse ecosystems, such as dry forests and savannas, which are vital for people and biodiversity, but may not meet the qualifications, unfortunately. And in addition to that, which is funny, that please don't quote me on that, Brazil says that 20% of the money will go to indigenous and local communities, yet these groups have historically received less than 1% of climate aid. And also, there's still no clear plan for how the funds will actually reach them. Another thing that I would love to talk about, which is very important, that might sound particularly significant, is that the World Bank has been confirmed as the trustee and interim host of the TFFF Secretariat, and it was, a big subject, a big pillar of conversation during the annuals, and it gave it control. It given control over governance, financial management, the fiduciary oversight, etc., etc. So the TFFF was also developed with analytical support from the World Bank, together with other institutions, demonstrating that it's not simply a Brazil-led idea, but rather a financial mechanism embedded in the same market-based logic, shaping the wider climate finance landscape. So it's literally showing again that the MDBs are actually diluting urgency precisely at a time when bold, united climate responses are more critical than ever. Because, as we all know, their governance is structured differently, because if we compare them to the UN, where all countries have an equal seat at the table, the governance of the MDBs is based on shareholder model representing member countries weighted or grouped together by their economic size, and consequently the priorities might change. So this new TFFF might look impressive, beautiful, I would say pretty, but in reality, it is a distraction from what developing countries truly need. What our countries need, and Amy mentioned it, is direct public finance, fair debt relief, and technology transfer that help communities protect forests, create jobs, and adapt to the impact of climate change. And adaptation is it's big actually for this COP, as Amy mentioned. So we don't need another financial product built on loans and market speculation, but we need a mechanism that builds equity, trust, and real support, but definitely not debt. And that's why the CAN community for this year, we are pushing for the BELEM action mechanism, or what we are calling BAM, which takes a completely different approach, because BAM is built around people, communities, women, youth, indigenous peoples, the people with disabilities, workers, and it's designed as a space not only for sharing knowledge, but also for mobilizing resources that directly reach those on the front line of the transition. So what BAM calls for is what we call the guiding principles to make sure that just transition stays true to the Paris Agreement, of course, rooted in human rights, labor rights, inclusion, and public participation. It's literally about international cooperation. So we are calling out for just transition policies to be eligible for climate finance because they are essential to help countries raise their ambition and also meet their climate goals. So another thing that BAM actually is pushing for is the just transition pathways that are supposed to be being part of the every country's national climate plannings. And I'm talking here about the NDCs, the NAPs, and also the long-term strategies. Because if we are talking about today, most NDCs are still far from what's needed. Many developed countries have not even updated theirs, and few include a clear plan to phase out fossil fuels or even provide the finance needed to help other countries meet their targets. And if we're talking about numbers, the latest report is showing that 70% of countries that mention just transition in their indices, but very few explain how it will be implemented. And this is exactly why international cooperation, through the BAM mechanism is so important, because it will help countries turn words into real action with funding, capacity, and also coordination. So also another thing that I forgot to mention is about the BAM. So the BAM is not a mechanism that will be implemented only under the UNFCCC space, but also outside the UNFCCC space. So this is the kind of mechanism that we should be building, and it's literally putting people at the center, strengthening local ownership, and bringing hope, and definitely not empty promises or debt. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Wafa, for that. I think you started off explaining about the TFFF headache that I only recently found out about, and I'm now beginning to try and understand. So I think that explanation was so important to explain what's happening. It's like a recurring nightmare that I personally have also with Article 6, which focuses on carbon markets. It feels like it's something along the same lines of it being a false solution. And also very interesting, your focus around the Just Transition Work Program. As someone who has seen South Africa struggling with their JETP, what they call the Just Transition Energy programs, and how the promised financing or the promised institutions that were supposed to support this Just Transition program have not come through, I think just shows to you how having a country-focused mechanism does not speak effectively to what actually becomes a good result. So I think that's the hope that's been carried on with this Just Transition Work Program within that conversation. And I would like to invite colleagues on the call to participate in a call by CAN International. And I think I just not tagged people, I've added the link. And in this call, they're basically trying to get 1,000 or 2,000 actually civil society organizations, trade unions, artisanal workers, informal laborers to all sign up to this call to push the negotiators in the Just Transition Work Program to produce this mechanism. My apologies. That said, I'd like to now ask my dear Ndugu, Sada. Sada, at COP29, Baku was all about finance. It was even titled the Finance COP. That was the focus, that was the beginning. First of all, have you recovered from the nightmare that was Baku for Africa in your own personal capacity? I'd like to know that first. But secondly, there's been a lot of talk about this Baku to Belém mechanism. What is that? Is this them trying to recover what was happening in Baku and didn't happen? Can you give us a bit explanation? And then also, what should be our focuses be around finance in Belém, since this is not necessarily the finance COP anymore?
Thank you, Kuda. To answer you, of course, I think we are all disappointed, and we are still disappointed from the COP29 outcomes on climate finance. And but I mean, that said, we still have to fight because we can't give up. This is the only space we have to continue fight for the delivery of even that an ambitious goal that we got, but also ask for more ambition around climate finance and also follow up on the implementation itself. So obviously COP30 is not going to be a climate finance COP, but as we all know, the climate finance outcome we got from Baku will have to remain central to the negotiations. And this how, because we need to speak to how this finance goal is going to be implemented and actually delivered, regardless of how ambitious it is. And one of the areas that we will be looking at is around a new agenda item, actually, that was introduced in Bonn by a group of developing countries around full implementation of Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement. This article speaks to the legal obligation of developed countries to provide public climate finance to support climate action in terms of adaptation and mitigation and loss and damage in developing countries. It has been the cornerstone of climate action. And this agenda was proposed because over time, we've seen the conversation from, especially from Baku, actually, in run-up to Baku and even since Baku, the conversation has shifted from provision of climate finance by developed countries to mobilization by other actors like MDBs and private sector. And obviously, we expect a lot of loan-based financing from these other actors because they are not mandated by the frameworks that we work with, the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. So over time, the core obligation of developed countries have been eroded, and the burden has been shifted to developing countries because we'll have to repay these loans, and this is going to tighten our fiscal space and even worsen the current debt stress that we have. And there's actually general also lack of political will from developed countries to even comply to this responsibility. They take every chance they get to evade and shift this key obligation to other actors that are not necessarily covered within the frameworks. So this necessitated developing country groups to come together and say, we need actually a space to follow up on this legal obligation. It's okay, you can expand the responsibilities to other actors, but what is the key responsibilities of developed countries in terms of public finance provision elements? And of course, this kind of delayed even the adoption of agenda in Bonn, but at least we got a format, informal consultations, where parties, of course, came together and highlighted the need and why we need to have a conversation on this implementation of this article. And there are so many divergences as we expect from the developed and developing countries. And we will see this conversation continue in Belém. But of course, we'll expect the presidency to also highlight this as a key element and try to bridge some of these fundamental issues that was addressed. Of course, we don't expect this agenda item to be adopted at COP. It's actually expected this consultation will continue until Bonn next year, but at least we expect the presidency to demonstrate some leadership here and even elevate this conversation to ensure that there's actually political signals around why we need this conversation, why we need a space, an institutional framework to enhance visibility of this conversation and also prioritize the implementation of this agenda item. And therefore, it's not really only a finance issue. I think this public finance element is going to be relevant for all other thematic areas and negotiation tracks, including adaptation, loss and damage, and just transition. Because you can all get these nice outcomes from these other technical thematic areas, but if you can't speak to the key role of public finance in implementing these actions into, these are deliverables or outcomes into real actions and implementation on the ground, then I think we are missing the point. So we need this COP30 to actually come out and say that this public finance element is important and we need to track it. Even within the NCQG, the new climate finance goal that we have, the element is still not clear. So we'll be just planning ourselves to fail if we don't really focus on this agenda. And I think even as CSO groups, we need to fully support developing countries as they make this demand. So that is one of the key issue. And actually, depending on how it's going to go, it might even affect the delivery of all other items at COP. So the second element I'll want to speak to is around the finance goal that we got in Baku. Yes, we had a finance goal, but there are some ambiguities or unclarity around some of the elements, for example, how this goal is going to be delivered actually. We've talked about the different contributors that are expected to contribute to this goal, but the current transparency and accountability frameworks that we have might not really support this goal to be delivered effectively and in a transparent manner. So this is not really an official agenda item, but I think it's important for parties to have a discussion either informal or in an informal setting, on how this 300 billion will actually be delivered. And how do you secure this implementation of this new goal, ensuring that there's that strong transparency and accountability? There are different quality elements, including the role of public finance in that goal, because it's not clear at the moment how much of that do we expect from developed countries, how much do we expect to be mobilized directly by provided directly by developed countries and also mobilized through public interventions. It's not very clear, and especially around public finance elements for adaptation and loss and damage. So I think these are conversations that also we need to have in Belem, and at least there's some, I would say, agreement between the two groups. For example, I'm talking about developed and developing countries on the need to actually clear on some of these issues, because we expect the new finance goal to take effect from next year. Those are the two elements that are key on climate finance. Maybe just to add on the loss and damage element. So as we all aware, this fund has been operationalized. Okay, the operationalization has been continuing since COP28, and we have some institutional arrangements that have already been completed for the fund for responding to loss and damage. But now we need to see some shifts towards delivery of the fund itself. We've been waiting for this fund to be up and running. Now it's time to deliver on some of the commitment and the reason why this fund was created in the first place. So recently, I think the board approved what they are calling a Barbados implementation modality, which they expect to launch it at COP30 to at least start initiating call for proposals for countries to apply and at least access around 5 to 20 million, I think, per project proposal, to sort of start the early interventions around loss and damage and how do we respond to it. And we expect this launch to happen at COP30. Of course, it's a good step, but even with that to happen, I think there's issues around some of the pledges that were done since COP28. I think they're around 700 and something million USD, which they have not been actualized until today. And I think for this fund to continue and provide support to developing countries, we need to see these pledges to be actualized. We also we need to hear more pledges from developed countries and others to this fund. And you'll see why this is even important to have this conversation around the public finance element, which is Article 9.1, because these funds are expected to be from public finance. These pledges are supposed to be delivered or provided in public finance, and therefore we need to have that conversation. And if we are successful in this fight for the agenda item on public finance, then I think we'll be securing guaranteed support for even loss and damage as well as adaptation, because that's the only sustainable and suitable funding source that can be done to implement those actions. The other element on loss and damage is the Santiago network for loss and damage, which is actually created to provide technical support to developing countries on how they respond and address issues around policies and loss and damage issues. And this network has not been operational simply because of lack of financing. There's really no guaranteed provision of finance to this network. And it's also, again, public finance that we expect to play a key role here. So all this is nicely tied to why this agenda item is being fought at this COP. And therefore, we'll expect the presidency at least to show some appetite and also strong political signals that will ensure that this agenda item is sustained in Belem and even beyond as we implement this new collective quantified goal. So those are the three key elements to speak to around finance that we expect to hear in Belem. Thanks, Kuda.
Thank you so much for that, Sada. I think in a lot of ways, what was interesting for me was how, starting from the first thing, the last thing that you mentioned, we won the loss into the damage fund fight, but we still have not won in terms of the transfer of their money into the accounts. And I think this is also what is endemic of the agreement that was made at COP29, that even though it was not what we expected and the figure being put at 300 billion, we still cannot trust the idea of the fund actually being actualized because of the lack of commitment and support. And just to add, I think that's where civil society also comes to support, where our support is not just us supporting African leaders, but also working with civil society from the globe to push their own governments to stick with their commitments. That is so important. And I think maybe something that we will not mention as much in this conversation is the agreement that came out, not the agreement, sorry, the decision that came out of the International Court of Justice and the opinion clearly stated that climate change is a state responsibility, and there definitely is a responsibility for those who are polluting to pay, and hopefully we can get a result of that. I'd like to now introduce and invite Amos to come on board to speak a bit more deeply around some connections that you're seeing between all these different tracks of negotiation and what that means. And before you come in, Amos, I'd like to invite dear listeners, for you to come on and share your comments or your questions in the question and A box or the chat box so that we can take them on board just after Amos speaks. Amos, up to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kuda, and I'm very much pleased to be speaking with you all. As the speakers have already mentioned, this COP30 in Belém has already been dubbed as an implementation COP. And like Mohammed mentioned, it is a defining moment to turn words into action. And for Africa, we have long faced challenges in accessing means needed to implement our climate solutions. But we know our challenges. This is not the time to rehash them. And I think it is time for us, for Africa, to clearly, again, re-articulate our priorities and demands. And for Africa, climate action and just transition is just more than reducing emissions. It's about unlocking the potential that we have on the continent to be able to contribute to a livable planet, but also help communities on the front line of this climate crisis to be resilient. We need to turn our potential to our superpowers. And Mohammed already mentioned some of the potential that we have on the continent. The abundant renewable energy potential, arable land, useful population. We need to transform this into engines of resilience and prosperity. We need to turn this into growing industries, use this potential to ensure that we have universal energy access, use these potentials to be resilient by having sustainable, resilient food systems, for example, and helping communities actually to adapt and build resilient and sustainable economies. And therefore, COP30 must ensure that the means of implementation align with the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, where it needs to help us redefine what climate finance means. Climate finance must be able to help us meet real needs of turning our potential into superpowers and reaffirming global solidarity. As Sada has already mentioned, COP30 provides us an opportunity to continue pushing and for the invoking of Article 9.1. As we currently sit here, the loss and damage fund remains largely empty. The pledges that were made were not up to scale, but they remain unmet. And we know that the finance gap between commitments and delivery keeps widening. But it is important that as we head to Belém, COP30 must connect climate action with other global economic justice processes. There is an ongoing process on UN Tax Convention, and coincidentally, as we'll be having COP taking place in Belém, we'll be having a UN Tax Convention sessions here in Nairobi. And the UN Tax Convention offers an opportunity to unlock trillions that we need for climate action, for nature and sustainable development. And this is by establishing a fair global tax rules for multinational corporations and introducing new polluter pay taxes on the super rich, but also oil and gas companies that needs to pay for the climate damages that they have caused the world, that Africa is disproportionately facing. And if COP30 can send a clear signal that it's time to make polluters pay, I think this will help because the UNTC is happening at the same time as COP30. It will help to the UNTC to concretely advance polluter pays taxation. And these resources need to go to already established funds. We've been struggling with funding the loss and damage fund. And we've seen very ridiculous pledges being met, although they still remain unmet. It is important that we link this time around the elements of fiscal justice, tax justice, with climate justice. And this UN tax convention process has the potential of helping developing countries, especially African countries, to curb what has been going on, the likes of tax abuse and illicit financial flows. It has the potential to empower African countries to have taxing rights, to be able to mobilize domestic resources that can be put into financing the climate solution, the just transition that we are talking about. So it is time for Africa to demand the recognition that the tax process is key to financing climate action and just transition. And like Kuda and Wafa have said, we need to reject false solutions. This recurring nightmare that Kuda referred to, such as carbon offset schemes that continue to exploit our communities while the polluters continue to benefit. So it is time for Africa to call for reaffirmation of the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, to call for reaffirmation of multilateralism and climate solidarity, and ensure that we have the much needed resources in form of climate finance that is predictable, that is accessible, that is fair, that will help Africa not only contribute to finding solutions to the challenges that we're facing, not only contributing to making our world stay within the limits that are livable, but also ensuring that there is resilient systems within our communities, and we are able to achieve resilient and sustainable economies and development that we require.
Thank you for that, Amos. I think you really brought the tax convention into play here. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also the G20 process. And again, the UNEA in December will be happening. So in as much as COP30 is one of the pathways, we should not forget the other things that are there. I do know that Mohammed might have to drop off at the top of the hour, but there's a very good question for you, Mohammed, from Victor in the question and answer section. So if you may, Ndugu, could you please just respond to that question from Victor, if you've had a chance to have a look at it, Mohammed?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Victor, for the question. I think there are a couple of things that I'll say firstly, which is, there is concern about what, a second Trump presidency could mean for global climate cooperation. The US remains a major emitter. Almost a third of the historic emissions are from the US. But the world cannot simply let, the ignorance of one man in the White House dictate the future of the planet. I think we need to crack on with or without the US. And COP30 could actually be a useful moment where the rest of the world comes together and takes action, irrespective of the antics of Trump. Much of the clean energy transition is now driven by economics as much as politics. In our continent, renewables are the cheapest form of new electricity. We know that, Trump is in the pockets of the fossil fuel industry, and ultimately it's the US itself that will miss out if it chooses to ignore, the benefit of clean energy. But let's also be honest, the US has always been a terrible force at COP summits. Even when there was a Democrat in the White House, they watered down agreements, they used delaying tactics, and generally, undermine efforts to deliver climate justice. So to some degree, there is no surprise. The US is the world's ultimate, largest petrostate. It's just that now it's not attempting to greenwash itself as some kind of climate leader. We can now see the US government for what it truly is. And so for us as Africans, in Belém, what we need is very clear. We need a fair deal that delivers finance for adaptation, as you've heard from my colleague, Emmy. And that has to work for vulnerable communities and countries. We need a deal that supports a just transition to renewable energy, that also safeguards, worker rights, community rights, and that's what my colleague in Wafa shared. We need to see the sharing of clean energy technology by the global north with the global south. We have the sun, we have the wind, we have geothermal. All that we're looking for is technology transfer and a bit of finance to help accelerate the deployment of renewables. And we need to see, the rich world that, has emitted the bulk of the emissions that, of course, climate change, and grown rich in part by, through the rest of us subsidizing their development, now sharing, climate finance by way of paying for their climate debt. If we got that, Victor, we will be able to actually help accelerate the transition and help safeguard Africa's interest. And that is the opportunity that we have. And that is something I think we can work to realize. Our 54 African countries are going to negotiate based on a shared common position. And that is a strength that we have. And I think that is something we should capitalize on. And I must also point out to colleagues that shortly we'll also be releasing another policy brief on green industrialization that my colleague Kuda has been leading on, that also explains how we can help, aggregate the resources that are available in our continent and accelerate, a green industrialization, where we can add value to our minerals in our continent rather than exploiting them in their raw form and then importing the finished products, using hard currency that we can hardly afford, which contributes to our debt crisis. So to break free from this vicious cycle, we're calling on Africans to lead and lead with a clear vision that helps us to tackle, the intersecting crises of climate, energy, development, poverty, debt together at the same time. And that is the opportunity that we've always called on Africa to realize.
Thank you for that, Mohammed. And I think I'll just like to echo your statement before you leave there to Victor's question, to say that Africa should not shield itself from the turning back of global commitments. We should lead the defense of multilateral processes. That's literally the moment. This is the moment we have an opportunity to actually say that we hear what you're saying, but for us, this is what we're doing. And I think Amy mentioned that the adaptation indicators, that idea came from Africa. This is not some idea that came from anyone else. So we already do the leading. And if anything, we're just being asked to do more of that leadership. And that's the opportunity that comes with this role. Thank you so much, Mohammed, for taking that question. I think you might be dropping off. If you decide not to, that's great. I got no issue there. Would you like to say goodbye or
thank you, friends, and see you in Belém, so that we can defend Africa's interest. And I'm sure with you guys, we'll realize the Belém outcome that we require. Looking forward to spending time with you and fighting this good cause with all of you. Asanteni.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. This does not mean all 44 of us should go, guys. We still have quite a number of questions to answer. And I hope for those who did come for Mohammed, you're at least staying for Amy, Amos, Sada, and Wafa. So there's some questions that I think are important to answer here. The first one is from Nay, I think. And I'll just read this out and then we'll see who can answer from the great team that we have here. And they say that my concern on the loss and damage fund, so I think this is more for Sada, is on how do they measure the harms and what parameters in terms of data to measure cost and damage and the yardstick for payments, especially in communities like the Niger Delta in Nigeria. I think it's a false tool of injustice. I think it's a false tool of injustice. You get the idea. How do you actually measure who gets that money we're being promised in the loss and damage fund? Sada, would you like to take that?
Yes, thanks, Kuda, for that. I'll attempt to answer that. So obviously, the technicalities around loss and damage, how do we measure, how do we cost it, and how do we talk about the methodologies for even estimating the financing needs and the cost of addressing to loss and damage, I will say is not fully developed at the technical level, but at least there is some progress in terms of some reports actually trying to cost the needs. Of course, it's an estimation, and definitely it will be also an underestimation because of some of the assumptions that have been used. But ideally, at the country level, the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage is the arm that was supposed to now provide technical assistance to countries to be able to assess and cost some of these needs. And as I said initially, it's actually paralyzed because there's no finance for this network to actually deliver on this mandate. And there's also that link between the fund, how the fund is operating, because that's one of the key success that we got. But the network was already in existence before even we had the fund. But now the fund is there. There's no really coherence and even correlation between what the fund is doing and what the network should be doing, because they're supposed to be complementing each other. So the fight now is to ensure now that the fund is up and it's now operating and it's doing the initial phase disbursement of the funds. We want to see more of coordination between the two. And now this brings back the issue of public finance, because we expect the pledges in terms of public finance to this fund. We also expect public finance to support this network. So recentering this whole conversation around public finance, it will now become important, not just for loss and damage, but also for other thematic areas, as I mentioned, including adaptation and just transition. And maybe the other thing I will mention is, of course, there's also no specific negotiation tracks on loss and damage at the moment. That's also one of the fights that developing countries are pushing for. We need a dedicated space to talk about loss and damage finance, where the fund now comes under that and any other things, including the network and the needs for support for the network as well. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks for that, Sada. I think this is why you're here. I could have never answered that so eloquently. So thank you so much for that. I'd like to then put up the question that was put up by
Sorry,
Lavender. Yes?
Could I just jump in and add to what Sada's already mentioned? And just
Yes,
to
please.
say that I think with loss and damage, one of the things to keep in mind is that economic losses in terms of physical damage, whether it be to infrastructure, to farms, or even in terms of income loss, are far easier to quantify and to recognize. What's far harder to cost, and I think then to appreciate and to value, is non-economic losses, particularly in terms of loss of life, loss of cultural heritage spaces, loss of culture in itself. These are really qualitative elements that are really hard to put a figure and a value on, but very important and valuable. And so I think Sada's point around the fact that this is not a negotiated agenda at the moment is really a massive priority for Africa, for climate vulnerable regions, and is also part of the concern around the fact that loss and damage is being sidelined with the focus, on adaptation, the Just Transition Work Program, and is typically something we've seen within the UNFCCC space and multilateral processes. As we focus on one issue, we start to sideline the other issues. And so perhaps just to emphasize the need for coordination here as Africans and as the Africa group, to make sure that these trade-offs are not happening across these different issues that are all vital for our climate resilient development, energy transitions, dealing with and addressing losses and damages. So just wanted to add that on to Sada's point. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Amy. I think it was great. And I think it actually speaks a bit to the next question I was going to ask, which is coming from Lavender. And Lavender basically puts this on board. And I think it's also for Wafa. But Wafa, if you struggle, I can answer. I can support in answering. And they state, how might this open letter and the broader Just Transition call begin to incorporate the language and principles of reparations, not only as a financial redress, but as a structural and historical repair for communities most harmed by colonial extraction and climate injustice? Wafa, would you want me to say that in French too, or you're okay with the English version?
I'm okay with both. Thank you so much. Well, I will try to answer because I think that you might know better and you have more information since you are in the Just Transition Working Group. But I would say that open letter that was sent actually is detailed enough, like just to put the informations on how I will just speak on the BAM mechanism again, because it's mainly, what we are pushing for this year. So BAM, again, is around communities, is around workers, is around smallholder farmers, is around people with disability, the frontline people that are suffering the most from the consequences of climate change. So I think that this is the best mechanism that we can have for this year and also for the next few years, because the launch will be this year. But again, the mechanism will be running for, for the next years, because it's not easy to be implemented. Fully this year, but it's like a whole process. And I'll be happy, just to give probably more details on how it will be processed, I would say. But on the details on just transition, especially the work program, probably Kuda can give more details on that.
So I'm taking off my moderating hat and going into my negotiating hat when I didn't want to. But I can give some questions and some answer at least a bit around the question preparations. And what we saw in terms of Bonn as well as the Africa Climate Week, fourth dialogue, which focused on energy and the Just Transition Work Program, Lavender, is a lot of global north countries are hesitant to add any new language into what's already there. So for example, we're currently fighting for the language that was agreed on at COP28 about the moving away from fossil fuels. So what you then have that if you add language like reparations, you're starting a whole other fight. This is not to say that we should not add it. That's not the question. But I do think from my own perspective, what is happening is that we want to position the mechanism as basically a tool to then say, now we're sitting at the table. We also forgot to talk about reparations. What are we doing about that? And that's the idea here. We want to leave with something institutional to support just transition, because the good thing and also the bad thing about just transition, anything can be just transition, but at the same time, not everything can be just transition. But that said, it then does call for us to be able to speak and have a focus on things that we need repair of. And I think that's what happens with the just transition. We are acknowledging those who have been left behind because of the processes that were developed and how we can then move forward. And hopefully that's a way of providing reparations. I see Amy's hand and then Amos's hand. Thank you for the support.
Yeah, thanks, Kuda and Wafa. I think perhaps just to add, and obviously I haven't been following the Just Transition Work Program nearly as closely as you, Kuda, but from my understanding, one of the things that Africa and developing countries have been pushing for is the inclusion of language around, this whole of society approach to a Just Transition Work Program. And I think that speaks to a recognition that from an adaptation perspective, at least, that climate impacts and, even adaptation initiatives can have unequal and unfair outcomes. Even if you will look at Africa's disproportionate vulnerability to climate change and climate impacts, it doesn't emerge in a vacuum. It's deeply political. It's been shaped by colonial legacies, these enduring structural inequalities. We're dependent on these climate sensitive sectors that are linked to our colonial history. We've also dependent and locked into aid and finance systems that keep Africa debt burdened, underfunded, tied to donor mandates. So I think there's a broader context here that needs to be recognized and acknowledged within how we speak about and what we talk about when it comes to a just transition, because so often we talk about the transition from one, function or mechanism or approach within a sector to another, but we often leave out the justice element of the transition. And so just to say that from some of the research that PowerShift Africa has been doing with partners over the course of this year is looking at what is just transition for adaptation or just adaptation, and also firstly to recognize that there's been resistance to this idea of adding in adaptation or recognizing adaptation in relation to just transition. But ultimately, I think it's about the form of restoration or restorative approaches can also be about recognition. So having, a recognition that there's a need for decolonial, internationally supported transformations that break climate colonialism patterns would be a huge step forward. Another step forward would be for developing countries, for Africa to have sovereignty over their transition pathways, over their adaptation pathways, and not be tied to these mandates or these funding conditions. And then also have these global resource transfers that I think all of us have spoken about at length over the course of this webinar. So just wanted to highlight that from an adaptation perspective, that it's also key to addressing these restorative aspects of climate impacts. Thanks.
Amos, please.
Yeah, just to add to what colleagues have already mentioned, the thing is for us to address the climate change challenge that we are faced with, we need to address it from a systems perspective. We need a systems change. And that's why it's important in this transition that we link conversations that are happening within this UNFCCC process with other processes, especially the processes that are linked to global financial systems transformation. Systems process that look at ensuring that there's global economic justice. Like Kuda mentioned, we might not want to introduce a new language around reparations in the COP process, but by acknowledging that there is a climate debt that needs to be paid by the polluters and developed countries in that process, and acknowledging that the polluters needs to pay in that process, it strengthens the ability of other processes that are seeking to transform global financial architecture to have that spike, to have that confidence to speak to making polluters pay. And I already mentioned processes that around UN tax convention. There is also calls for a UN debt convention. So we need to approach all these issues holistically, so that we are able to adequately address the challenges that we face today from the climate crisis. Just to add something small around the methodologies of calculating the climate debt and thus informing the loss and damage fund. It is true, we have other studies that have already been conducted, and there is existing data, but like Sada mentioned, it is sometimes not representative of the true cost borne by especially developing countries and African countries by them addressing the losses and damages that we face. So maybe as a challenge to all of us, we need to come up with new methodologies that can inform the true cost and inform the true climate debt that is owed to communities, to Africa, and that way we can use those figures to demand for loss and damage funding.
Thank you for that, Amos. I'm seeing a lot of questions are now coming through, which always happens with these things. People are shy in the beginning, and then they realize, no, this is an open democracy. I have rights and I can say things. So if you allow me, and also my apologies, I recognize your hand. Is it Umo? But may you please put it in a written format so that we can quickly go through as many questions as possible, unless it's a contribution. And then Wafa, I give you the chance to speak, and then I'll ask about 3 questions at the same time, and then I'll give back to the panelists to then speak. So Wafa, you can go first, because I saw your hand was raised first, and then I'll ask the other 3 questions in one.
Yeah. Briefly, actually, just to add on what was mentioned before on just transition. So the problem was on the definitions, because Amy mentioned like the definitions of just transition, what it means for us, especially in the global South countries. And it was the same problem actually for climate finance last year, because we didn't have a clear definition. And I believe that BAM gave a very clear definition on the just transition for this year. It's the transition that is supposed to be driven by people, is centered around people. Another thing, actually, I just seen like a very brief comment in the chat on can Africa is supposed to be boycotting COPs. I hear you, my friend, but allow me to say that COP is happening with or without us. So boycotting is not the solution. Leaving the space for other people to decide on our behalf is the problem. So we have to be there and we have to defend our people and we have to speak on behalf of the communities that are mostly affected. One last thing actually that I would love to mention is that I forgot on the for solutions is that this COP presidency is also pushing for biofuels, which is also something that we are not accepting, and can has made a whole position on it because it's being promoted like largely as a renewable solution, but in reality, many of these approaches are causing deforestation, land grabs, rising food prices, and harm to communities, especially indigenous people that they are claiming to protect in the Amazon forests. And yeah, so if we have to be very clear, bioenergy is not a real alternative to fossil fuels. It cannot replace a just transition. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Wafa, for that impassioned speech. And I'd also like to recognize the comment made by Shepard in the chat box, where you speak about the complexities of some of these funds, and also the point that was also made about the loss and damage fund and the danger of some of these funds, where we have a political class that really prefer, instead of using such funds for climate redress, they prefer to buy Mercedes-Benz and other forms of corrupt ways. And I think that's a very strong reality. But as one colleague always reminds me when it comes to this corruption issue, that we should not focus on the tree and forget the bigger forest. And the bigger forest here is just the very fact that there's absolutely no climate financing happening. And this is not to then say that we are saying we should ignore corruption, but we're saying we should not put primacy on the thing that is not primal. Let's get the funds first as we sort out the dangers that come with this corruption. And the two questions, there have been quite one or two questions that were linking with issues around climate finance, which is totally fine. And I've tried to put them as one. And there's also another question from Kwaile, which is quite substantive. So I'll start with the finance one, which states, how will COP30 ensure that climate adaptation finance moves from pledges to predictable ground-based funding that actually reaches communities on the front lines in Africa? I'm happy about this, Amy, because this is an adaptation question. So I'm happy we got an adaptation question, albeit an adaptation finance question. And then the one from Kwaile, which I think might be our last question for the day. Kwaile, my brother, you state that given the dual nature of COP30, where the action agenda remains non-negotiated and voluntary, while the negotiated track carries politically binding commitments, I resonate on the risks that this presents. How can countries ensure that their priorities for finance, adaptation, and just transitions are not sidelined in a voluntary process? What mechanisms can safeguard that the action agenda complements rather than dilutes Africa's core demands within the negotiated outcomes? I think that's a fantastic question around something that we've not spoken about a lot here, which is the other conversation that happens at COP processes, which is the action agenda. So I'll ask Amy if you can speak to adaptation finance, and from the other two or three colleagues who has the guts to respond to Kwaile's question around the action agenda, I'll keep it free for all. So over to you, Amy.
Thanks, Kuda, and thanks for the question. I believe it came from Michael David. Yes, I think first thing to say is that with great difficulty will we turn these pledges into predictable grant-based finance. So, you know, this is really going to be a political issue rather than a technical issue, and will require all hands on deck in terms of coordination across African stakeholders, the Africa Group, you know, combined with working together with other climate vulnerable regions and groups, G77 plus China, AOSIS, ALAC, you know, recognizing that it's not only us that, as Africa, despite our disproportionate vulnerability to climate impacts, that are suffering from this vast adaptation finance and implementation gap, and that we really need to coordinate and work together with other climate vulnerable regions to place pressure on the negotiations, not only within adaptation, but importantly to coordinate with negotiators across other finance tracks. I mean, across other negotiation tracks, particularly the finance track, to make sure also that things firstly aren't being traded off. So outcomes in adaptation aren't being traded off in favor of the Just Transition Work Program, in favor of mitigation, or something on finance, or Article 9.1, for instance. So I think that would be my first message, is that we need that strong coordination, that agency, that leadership that was demonstrated so clearly at the African Climate Summit. We need a replication of that at COP30 to come out in full force and really place pressure on these negotiations. And we've done it previously, and that's how we secured the global goal on adaptation, and we reinvigorated negotiations on adaptation in itself. But linked to that, I would say that one of the things we really need to then secure through this coordination are those strong means of implementation indicators that track quality adaptation finance, technology transfer, and capacity building, because these indicators will basically tell us how developed countries are delivering to developing countries in terms of both provision and receipt of support for adaptation in relation to the global goal on adaptation. But importantly, I think here what we need is a link from the adaptation negotiations around the global goal on adaptation and these indicators to the finance negotiations or finance negotiators, and some form of political commitment on adaptation finance. So I think I mentioned earlier in my remarks that this year is the deadline for developed countries to deliver on the Glasgow pledge to double adaptation finance to developing countries. And once that expires, if no new political commitment is put in place, we lose an opportunity, we lose the political momentum that's been generated around adaptation. And so what we're calling for is a new commitment of immediate tripling of adaptation finance by 2030, but recognizing that this is not sufficient to bridge that adaptation finance gap, and that it would need to be coupled with an official process under the UNFCCC and COP that then looks at a needs-based goal, needs-based regime in relation to the GGA and helps cost the process or costs achieving the targets, the GGA targets. So to me, that would be the best way to secure this predictable grant-based finance, making sure that it's accessible, predictable, grant-based. I'll stop here, but perhaps Sada might want to jump in with any other thoughts, reflections on how we can secure these outcomes for adaptation finance.
Thanks, Amy. I think you've covered it nicely. It's a political intervention, and we need a strategy around it. Maybe just to respond on the conflicts between the action agenda and the negotiated outcomes and how we want to see it balanced out. Of course, I think it's a risk that we've seen from the start, actually from the COP30 presidency, and how they have been pushing this whole agenda on action agenda as opposed to the negotiated outcomes. But I think for us as developing countries, even as Africa, our key priority is to see the outcomes that we want in the negotiated outcomes, because that is the multilateral process. Action agendas are normally driven by the country or the presidency. And we've seen so many of these agenda items, action agendas in different COPs, and there's really no follow-up even to see how they are implemented and how they even feed into the negotiation. They have always been destructive instead of complementing the negotiation process. But the way it has been packaged by this COP presidency is his way of sort of connecting the negotiations to the realities on the ground to enhance implementation, but that's not going to actually actualize. So I think for us is to focus on the negotiated outcomes that we can actually hold people accountable to, as opposed to some voluntary national or presidency initiative that is not going to deliver for countries. And you can already see an example of the TFF that Wafa talked about. It's not something Brazil is already pushing it, but honestly speaking, you've already seen the loopholes and the risks that come from this TFF. So we don't really, of course, that's something we need to maneuver as African countries who are going to be at that COP, not to be distracted by the flashy action agenda items that are always launched. There's always whole initiatives. Probably you don't even know about them, but probably there will be more than 10, 11 initiatives that are not going to be launched at this COP, but they don't necessarily translate to what we want or complement the negotiated outcomes that we want to see. So I think it's just to maneuver that and ensure that we're not distracted from why we are there in terms of the multilateral process that everyone is held accountable for, and we can actually follow up in the next COP, as opposed to these action agenda items that actually die after that COP and you'll never hear about them. The next COP presidency will also come up with his own action agenda items. So it's not very sustainable, and I think we should not even give it priority. But of course, we have to acknowledge the concern around the risk that it might pose on the action agenda, on the negotiated outcomes that we want to see from COP. Thanks.
Yes, thanks so much for that, both of you, Amy and Sada. Amos, I'll give you a minute. We are over time, and it's important to respect each other's time as much as possible, but I'll give you a minute to answer, and then I'll conclude, and we can all wave goodbye to each other in an amicable way.
Yeah, I just wanted to add two distractions that happen at COP processes where you find parties are moving away from negotiation rooms and making pledges elsewhere. They do not work. We have seen that with just energy transition partnerships that were announced at COP26. They have not worked. South Africa is an example for that. So what I think is Africa needs to remain united, because if we don't, then we are separately hung. These initiatives are cherry-picked, and they come on the terms of developed country parties that are escaping accountability within the negotiated, official negotiated process. So yeah, I just wanted to add that. But quickly also, we cannot stop holding polluters accountable on the account of corruption. Actually, governance issues on our continent should give us more energy for us to work towards shifting the systems on the continent. And that's why it's important that we look at these things holistically.
Thanks so much, Amos, for that. And I think, first of all, I'll also just like to thank for the incredible knowledge that all the presenters have been able to share today. This, I think, has been really worth it. And I hope you carry on these conversations. We know those who are going to COP. We know some of you will be staying behind to fight on Twitter, to carry on pushing the message. And let you not being at Belém limit your participation. For those who can get participation, it's through online platforms where you can follow the COP process. That's equally as important. We have powerful civil society networks on the continent, and we just hope at Partnership to Africa that this policy we've released helps guide you in terms of your understanding of the COP process. But I'd also like to flesh out what's also coming from CAN Africa, where a coalition of civil society organizations have also produced Africa priorities for COP30 in terms of how to best work as civil society for some of the priorities that we have. So it's great work coming out, and we should all take this material on board to guide our arguments, our discussions as much as possible when we do get into this COP space. As President Samora Machel would say, a luta continua, victoria, etc., which basically means the struggle continues, but more importantly, victory is certain. The victory is certain. Beat COP30, beat COP31, beat COP32. Africa will get its right to development, and also we will avert the climate crisis. Thank you, everyone. See you in Belém. See you on Twitter. We keep pushing.
Thank you. See you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.